report on the violence inside Britain's prisons, where a guard is assaulted on average almost every hour of the day. Prison officers are now speaking out about the violence they endure on an almost daily basis, with shocking images released to show what they're going through. A new report warning of chronic staff shortages in some areas and revealing how many officers resign under the brutal pressures of the job. Now, a warning, what we're about to show you is a prison officer who has been slashed in a razor attack, and you may find the images upsetting. This shocking picture was handed to us with the permission of the man in the picture, who's an officer at HMP Humber in East Yorkshire. The Prison Officers Association exclusively shared this image and others after another attack on a guard at the same institution to reveal what officers are going through, and this is far from an isolated incident. Official statistics revealing there were almost 8,000 assaults on prison staff in a single year. That's an average of 23 times a day. Assaults have soared over the last 14 years, up 170%. Now, the finger of blame of why this has happened is often pointed at austerity and the cuts that came along with that. And information today from the Criminal Justice Joint Inspectorate warning a third of prisons have seen staff numbers drop. While prison numbers keep growing up, the rate of prison officers leaving is at 13%, and many of those leaving are some of the most experienced in the job. Now, most of us will never see the inside of a prison. They are, by definition, out of sight, out of mind. But this is surely an issue worthy of attention. Not only are people who volunteer to do a difficult, dangerous and necessary job being beaten and traumatised out of it, but as this part of the system breaks down or backs up, other parts break too. And that affects everyone, guilty and innocent, inside the system and out. This isn't how justice is meant to work. So what is to be done? I'm joined in the studio this evening by Steve Gillan, General Secretary of the Prison Officers Association, down the line by former prison officer and governor turned visiting criminology professor at Staffordshire University, Ian Aeson. Thank you, gentlemen, very much. Now, Steve, I will start with you in the studio, if you don't mind, because what more can you tell us about the case of that man that we just showed our viewers, the terrible, terrible injuries he suffered? What happened to him and why did he agree to have these photos shared?
Well, that individual, his injuries were caused by a ceramic cup, not by a razor. He decided to come forward because he saw an interview last week on Sky News with regards to violence against prison officers. And he was so incensed because then he saw one of his colleagues at the same prison on Friday, a young officer, being slashed in the face with a razor, and it brought all the memories back. And I salute this officer for giving us permission to show the severe injuries, life-changing injuries really, that he had to endure, and take back to his family. So it's not just prison officers that suffer, it's actually their families as well, because nobody should be coming home in that condition. That was a life-threatening injury that officer had at Humber. And I've got to say, the one that was slashed on Friday, he's ended up with 54 stitches in his face.
54 stitches, unbelievable. And thank you for the clarification on the original injury and then what that spurred him on. Once he saw this later injury from somebody else, he decided to share his story. So, I mean, to some extent, people might wonder if this has just always been a case in the prison system, these types of injury. But have you seen an uptick in the type of violence?
Well, I think your stats have demonstrated that in the pre-run there. They've gone up by well over 100% since 2010, because we had more prison officers then and less prisoners in 2010, and lots more experience as well. We've seen a dramatic increase since 2010 up to the present day. Now, look, I've been around the criminal justice system in prisons for 33 years. Prisons have always been dangerous places, and you're never going to totally eradicate the risk of injury to prison officers, but you can minimise the risk and take certain actions to ensure that risk dramatically reduces. And what we're really seeking from the employer, and we've been campaigning on this now since 2018, about razor attacks and so forth. And one of the simplest answers is to make a crucial decision and take razors out of that environment and give them battery-operated razors as a replacement. I think it comes down to budgets. That's why they're reluctant to do it.
That seems like a very straightforward solution to limiting razor attacks. Let's go a bit further into why you think there isn't change happening. You mentioned budget being one of them. What else have you noted in the last decade that we've just shown with this exponential rise in attacks? Why is this happening in the system?
I think it's happening for a variety of reasons. I think discipline has gone out the job. Security used to be the number one priority in the prison service, and keeping people safe, both prisoners and staff. And I think that's come a back seat now for getting people out of cell just to do nothing, quite frankly, apart from assault prisoner on prisoner and then prisoner on staff. And I want to see us go back to basics again, which means a root and branch review of everything that we do in the prison service. And that's why my union has been calling for a royal commission, not just into prisons, but the whole criminal justice system. We need to go back to basics, because if we don't go back to basics, I might be on here one day talking about the death of a prison officer.
That's not something we hope to have you back on to talk about.
Exactly.
That's why we need to get this situation spoken about at this stage, and we will shortly speak to somebody from the government about this as well, what actions they're taking. Let's cross now though to Ian Aeson, former prison governor turned criminology professor, and perhaps Ian, you can talk to us about why you made that transition from governor to academic in this.
Well, I left the prison service a large number of years ago, but I've been involved in prisons and imprisonment and violent extremism in prison and violence in prison ever since. And I think, if I may say, you and Steve both have set out very clearly the statistics there, the human cost of violence in prison. And I wish that prison officer and his family well. But the question that also needs to be asked is, how on earth, in the face of such endemic violence, can rehabilitation take place in prison where staff are scared? It simply doesn't happen. Safety in prisons is absolutely foundational to anything else hopeful that happens there. And what is quite clear at the moment, by those awful statistics that you've quoted, a 16% rise year on year, incidentally, of assaults, and serious assaults with life-changing injuries such as the ones that we've seen, are running at about 700 or 800 a year as well, is a system that cannot deliver any meaningful form of rehabilitation with prisoners because there is so much violence. These places have always, as Steve has said, and certainly in my time as well, working in a Cat B prison as a prison officer, they've always been saturated with risk, as it were. But it seems to me that the ferocity of the violence, particularly against prison staff, and how spontaneously it can happen, and the seeming inability of prisons and prison leadership to be able to combat this epidemic of violence is all you need to know when you look at the statistics about recruitment and retention of prison officers. Prison officers are currently recruited, and I believe they're trained for 7 weeks, which is by some margin the smallest amount of training that you will get anywhere in Europe for a very difficult and complex professional role. And then they're thrown onto prison landings that are, routinely awash with blood and violence, and you can see that in some of the pictures that you've seen. So it is no surprise to me, frankly, that prisons are losing staff effectively faster than they can recruit them. There has been a significant amount of work that has gone into attracting staff into the job, and the pay actually isn't that bad, relatively speaking, now to what it has been. So something else is going on, and certainly when you analyse the exit interviews that have been publicised, you've got to look hard for them, by the way, but they are out there by the Ministry of Justice. The working environment is one of 3 key issues that comes up time and again. And this is why I believe you get young prison staff recruited hastily, trained extremely poorly, and that's not just the duration of the training. I believe that's the training doctrine as well, and it speaks to something Steve has said about discipline being a dirty word in the prison service, effectively being driven out of it. And then you get these youngsters thrown onto prison landings where you've got sophisticated prisoners who they are scared of, frankly. Now, when I was doing this job, just to finish the point, back in the 90s when I was a prison officer, the attraction of the job and the meat of the job was getting out and around prisoners day to day, and being able to talk to them, develop good relationships with them, support them in all the small ways, frankly, that stop frustrations boiling into violence, and doing what is still and is not recognised as being an extremely sophisticated job. Now, I had the backing of experienced staff when I was doing that, because I made plenty of mistakes, believe me. But I had the backing of staff who were many years in the job. Many of them were ex-services. Many of them were ex-miners, frankly, when I was learning the job. People with experience of life who'd come into the job from other types of work. And I knew that because the training was actually very good at the time and the support was there. If there was a problem, there would be an overwhelming response to be able to deal with that problem. And prisoners knew that too. And prisoners, frankly, most of them want prisons run by prison staff. They do not want prisons run by feral, predatory drug dealers. And unfortunately, in many of our prisons in the present day, the balance of power is shifting towards the people who are not wearing a uniform, frankly. That's why you're getting people leaving the job almost before their probation is finished.
You painted a very thorough picture there. Thank you for that wealth of insight, Ian. Just finally, Steve, before we continue this conversation on with Sir Bob Neill MP, I just wanted to ask you, off the back of what we heard there from Ian and your points you made at the start, beyond what you've said, a very practical measure involving raises, what would help from the government in this case?
Investment and higher salaries for staff, actually, because pay's been eroded year on year effectively since 2010. But Ian made a very important point then about when he was a prison officer in the 1990s. I was as well, all through the noughties as well. The reality is, in the 90s, there was 43,000 prisoners. Now there's double that amount. And we had more prison officers then than what we've got now, looking after 87,000. So there needs to be change, and there needs to be change very, very quickly. I actually got a lot of time for Alex Chalk, the Secretary of State. I think he wants to do things because he listens to us as a trade union very, very carefully. But they've got to stop being afraid, actually, of making important decisions. And some of those important decisions in relation to the increase in PAVA in the juvenile estate, so that our members are protected. We need to stop worrying about potential legal challenges from pressure groups, because some of these pressure groups would actually want prison officers having no defence mechanisms whatsoever, and then we really would be in trouble. So I urge him to make the brave decisions in relation to protecting prisoners and prison officers, because I do worry that it is getting more and more violent. And we've just seen the pictures. We've been on about this for quite some time. And in relation to the prison hierarchy, to be fair to them, we have spoken and we've had really constructive dialogue as far back as 2018. But the leadership listened to us about raises, and they put out a mandatory actions to all governing governors to carry out risk assessments and safe systems of work. And they were to be concluded by the end of April 2018. I very much doubt they were ever done, quite frankly.
Some really concrete examples of what you need to see in the system. Steve Gillan, we appreciate having you in the studio as ever, Ian Aeson as well. Now, the crisis in our prisons has been rumbling along for years, as we've already painted at the top of the show. Well, one man who's been looking into it is Sir Bob Neill, who's a Conservative MP and chair of the Justice Select Committee. Thank you very much for making time. I hope you were able to listen into that conversation just now with Steve.
I did, Rosanna, yeah, thanks.
Would you like to respond then to the recommendations that Steve Gillan of the Prison Officers Association was saying, that, you know, he backs the intentions of what the Conservative government has tried so far, but we just need to see more investment and braver decision making?
Well, I thought Steve and Ian both put it in a very balanced way, if I may say, and they both given evidence to our select committee over the years, and I wouldn't disagree with their fundamental analysis. Ours is a cross-party committee, as you know, and we have carried out a number of investigations in the past and have flagged up these issues, the problems with the workforce, the problems with the overcrowding of our prisons, and also the very poor physical state of the prisons, because it's not just an austerity issue, because frankly, you know, I was a barrister in practice doing criminal work all for nearly 30 years before I came into the House of Commons. We've had decades, absolutely decades, of underinvestment in our prisons. The massive maintenance backlogs, and we're crowding too many people into them. So we did a survey as part of our current inquiry into the prison workforce, and you won't be surprised to know, Rosanna, that there's something like 50% of prison officers felt that they were unsafe at one point or another during their work. Nearly 2/3, about 70% nearly, felt that they weren't valued sufficiently. So sensible measures to improve security. Steve's raised one there. I think we should be getting behind. We certainly should be backing anything that gives officers the defensive tools that they need. And I agree with him. I think Alex Chalk does want to do the right thing. And I'm sure if Alex is able and gets the support from his colleagues to take measures like that, he'd certainly have the support of myself and many others in the field. I think the other thing, though, Rosanna, we need to think about is this. There is this real problem with attrition in the workforce, as has been referred to. The key officer grades are the bands 2 to 5, if you like. They're the people out on the wing. And there is a real problem of a lack of experienced officers staying in the prison service. That means that you've got youngsters who, for all the reasons you set out, are being put in very difficult and vulnerable positions, and they don't have the old hands who often can build relationships with prisoners that diffuse things. I think so we are calling for a proper national workforce strategy for the prison service. There isn't one at the moment. Better training, as Ian referred to, has got to be part of that too. Now that does require investment, but there's another side to it too. Our prisons are almost at bursting point. We've got very, very little headroom at all because the prison population's grown exponentially. And there are two reasons for that. In the short term, that's because there are some 6,000 prisoners who are on remand. These are people who have not been convicted of any offence. They're on remand for far longer than they used to be before and in bigger numbers. That's partly because I think we haven't reassured magistrates that it's safe to release people with, for example, tags and curfews. Better to keep them outside. Remember, a considerable percentage of those, but certainly a percentage, will actually be acquitted at their trial, and others will not get custodial sentences. So that's not a good use of the space to have them banged up. Second point, just to finish, is we need to get the backlogs in the court system of the way. They're in prison waiting trial, and that's back to the point I think Steve and Ian made. It's all part of the joined-up system, Rezo.
It is a joined-up system. It's multi-layered and complex. It's to do also with immigration, population growth, policing, all these things that feed into overcrowding in the prisons. I mean, it's almost every level of society. I just want to ask you finally, I'm interested to know why this issue doesn't get as much investment and attention and progress as is needed. You've just painted to me their decades worth of decline. Is it just because it is out of sight, out of mind?
I think in large measure it is, I'm afraid, and that's because politically, to put it colloquially, it's not sexy. There aren't votes in prisons. Sadly, there aren't votes in criminal justice. So it's fundamental, actually, to protecting us all and for a free society. And one of the sad things, I think, is that we have a bit of a bidding war between all political parties as to who can be tougher. That means the prison population goes up more and more, but we're not providing the prison places and the prison officers to cope with that. And we need to have an honest conversation as politicians with the electorate and with society and say, look, a prison place costs about £47,000 a year. Now, for a dangerous person, for a serious criminal, that's money well spent. There's an awful lot of people in the prison system where they're largely because of chaotic lifestyle, because they've been failed by the education system, by the social services, by mental health services and so on. Are there not better ways of dealing with them rather than that £47,000 a year? We need to have an honest conversation about that, and unfortunately, that never gets high and far enough up the political agenda.
So Bob Neal, MP, thank you very much for making time for us this evening, and to Steve and Ian as well.